Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Mullard. I'm the head of marketing with EnerData. Welcome to this webinar on power generation companies. Today as speakers, we have Baptiste Possemé, who's the head of our power department. Hi, Baptiste.
Hello, everybody.
And we have also here Maëlys, who's a senior analyst at EnerData. Hi, Maëlys.
Hello.
So the webinar will last about 30 to 40 minutes today with an additional 10 minutes of Q&A. So feel free to start any question that you have using the Q&A chat box of Zoom, okay? And basically the whole idea of this webinar is to try and figure out whether or not the companies, the power generation companies, are in line with the climate objectives. And, you know, as you all know, the electrification is a key lever of decarbonization. And this, well, we'll try and quantify in this webinar, at the beginning of this webinar, what is required in terms of addition of carbon-free capacities. So the whole idea here is not to finger point one player or another. It's just to have a, let's say, a clear and basic picture of where do we stand at world level in terms of capacities addition company by company. Right? Next slide, please. A few words about EnerData. So we're an independent research company established in 1991, specializing in energy, of course, but also in research, intelligence, data, and modeling. We're about 70 people based out of Renewable, French Alps, and Singapore. And basically, what do we sell? We sell access to our data platform, and we'll sell also research and consulting on energy markets and scenarios, leveraging our models. That's in a nutshell. Now, I will leave the floor to our panelists here, Baptiste and Maëlys. So please proceed.
Hello, everybody. Just a few introduction words. So the work that we're going to show today is part of one of our products called EnerData's company dashboard. So if you already know some of our products, one of them is our power plant tracker. So it's a huge database covering all countries, asset by asset, with the detail of each power plant. But in this product, we have several modules in terms of LCOEs, in terms of auctions, in terms of renewable support policies, for instance. If some of you are already a client of this interface, you can have a look at the top here. That's an example of the interface. You have a company dashboard link. And in this link, you'll find full dashboards with the detail of assets, the detail aggregated values in terms of thermal, renewable, hydro, nuclear capacities, with an historical background. And with 40 companies, the 40 main companies that are covered, but also 183 that for which we provide dashboards based on a bottom-up approach, so asset-by-asset analysis. Feel free to contact Christian after this webinar if you want to know more about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, good point. And I mean, besides the asset level data and company level data, there's insightful indicators such as the CO2 emissions of each and every player and the carbon factor of each and every player.
Yes. And so just a few details, a few methodological points to make sure that we're all on the same page for the slides that we're going to present. We're going to talk a lot about GenCos, so generation companies. We're focusing here on the companies that own the power plant, the power plants. It's not necessarily the same as the one operating the power plants. We'll be taking most of the time 2015, sometimes 2016, but as a reference year to see the evolution in terms of capacity, production, CO2 emissions, for instance, due to the fact that that's when the Paris Agreement was signed. The data is taken mostly from annual report of companies. So we're talking about validated data by external audit firms. We focus only on the electricity part, not on heat or gas production, for instance. And of course, it will be too easy if every company had exactly the same kind of presentation, the same level of data coverage. So behind what we're going to present here, there is a huge work that has been done by Maëlys and by other analysts at Data of harmonization, of data gathering, of hypothesis as well, to make sure that we can cross-check and present something that's reliable. We're covering the full scope of operation of companies. So take into account that when we present, for instance, this is especially true, for instance, for European companies. They tend to have an international portfolio of power plants. So when if it's not stated otherwise, when we present the installed capacity of a company, it's international and not only in the continent or the region we're showing them. And in some cases, we had to we didn't have the detail between coal, gas, oil, for instance. So in this case, this is regrouped in a thermal category. Finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll be talking more about CO2 emission data. Please take into account that we'll be only speaking of scope 1 emissions, so the CO2 emission directly produced by the generation of electricity from those players. And when we're talking about carbon factor, it's so the company's total CO2 emission divided by the total power generation of the company. Also, some of you may know that following the Paris Agreement, we did not have pledges at company level or even at region or continent level in terms of carbon factor or in terms of CO2 emissions. What we'll be using to give an insight on what is the right path, what is a possible path to reach a world below 2 degrees by 2050 is one of EnerData's key products, actually called EnerFuture, which is an energy climate scenario in which we developed 3 main scenarios: business as usual, one where the country's NDC, so the country's objectives are met, and finally the one we'll be using, EnerGreen, which is a scenario in which we detail how to contain global warming under 2 degrees. Of course, this is not a forecast, and it only shows a path towards achieving the Paris Agreement. It's obviously not the only possible path, but it's one of them. And it does not only cover power generation. So to give you a broad snapshot, we look at efficiency gains, the share of the electrification of demand in terms of heat pump, in terms of electric cars. But what's interesting here is to see that in 2050, in this scenario, 95% of the electricity production is CO2 free. We covered for this analysis 40 GenCos, so 40 electricity generation companies. We have a scope that represent approximately a third of the global installed capacities, so 3 terawatts of capacities. There is a focus on Europe and North America, where for which we covered respectively 48 and 41% of the installed capacities. But also a strong focus on Asia, especially China. We'll do a specific focus on China, for which we have 29% of coverage rate. We'll talk a bit less about CIS. So CIS is the Community of Independent States. So to summarize, Russia and the neighboring countries, and Latin America, including both Central and South America. To give you an overview of what we will not be covering, it's important to have this in mind. We compared on the left here, you have a summary of the installed capacities by region for the selected companies only. And on the right, you have the same graph, but based on the total installed capacities by region. So you can see slight differences. The first one is that, so the pink part here and here, they tend to be an overestimation of nuclear capacities in Europe and in North America. This is especially true due to the inclusion of companies like EDF in Europe, CC in the US, for instance, that are the largest owners of nuclear power plants in their respective regions. On the other hand, on Asia and CIS, since we did not include Chinese-focused nuclear companies and Russian and Ukrainian Energoatom and Rosenergoatom nuclear-focused companies, these won't appear in the upcoming analysis. Also, there is an underestimation of solar assets in particular, due to the fact that a large share of solar installation is distributed. It can be either owned by SMEs, households, for instance, but also specialized companies. And we'll see that in more detail for China, but it tends to be a key trend in the evolution of the share of GenCos around the world. So I'll go directly to the global trends of GenCos. We'll focus then on in China, and we have a look at in terms of CO2 emissions, how far we are to a possible path to Paris Agreement. First, we are going to look at installed capacities. So in this graph, you see for each of the companies, for each of the 5 regions that we looked at, the line represents the total installed capacity, and the bars represent the share of thermal, hydro, non-hydro, so solar and wind essentially, and nuclear capacities. What you can see is first that Chinese companies, so the first 5 one here are the Chinese GenCos that we analyzed. They are largely dominant. The only non-Chinese company that is on par with the 5th one, so China Three Gorge Power Generation Company, is EDF in France. Which has a very concentrated activities, but a large, especially in Europe, the market is very distributed compared to China. And there is also a strong dominance, as you can see, of thermal production still. So we are still quite far, and we'll confirm that afterwards, from a world where we got rid of coal, oil, and gas power plants. And if we try to look at key trends in terms of companies, first we see at least 4. Could have said the same almost about CMS in Northern America here, but at least 4 here, and here that are thermal focused, for which over 90% of the installed capacity is thermal production. So PT-PLN in Indonesia, for instance, Gazprom in Russia, Vistra Energy in the US. Then we have 7 companies that are hydro focused. so for which over 50% of their capacity comes from hydro capacity. For instance, Hydro-Québec in Canada, Electrobras in Brazil, Statkraft, Verbund US in Europe, Roshydro in Russia, and in China, the CTPG, which is historically focused on the very loud Three Gorge hydro dam, but not only today. And three that are nuclear-focused companies, in particular EDF. We included as well CZ, so the Czech national player for electricity, and CEC in the US. The rest tends to have more diversified mix and this diversification is especially present. It's been especially present the last 10 to 20 years due to a growing share, as we'll see, of renewables. If we look at the same graph, but in terms of power production, I'm going to switch slides, but you will see little differences here. The key difference is that here we're talking about power generation. And if I come back to the previous one, the largest difference that you can see is the green part here, the non-hydro renewables. So for instance, for CEIC, in terms of capacity, 25% of the capacity is solar and wind. But if we look in terms of production, it's only 11 to 12%. This is due, of course, to the lower capacity factor of solar and wind, sorry. And it should always be cautiously considered when looking at the evolution of such capacities, because companies tend to speak in terms of capacities rather than production, which can be counterintuitive when you look at the evolution of CO2 emission at the end. When I'm speaking about capacity factors, if you're not familiar with the term, on the bottom left here, it's the total production of an asset divided by what it would have produced if it would have produced at full capacity over the year. So the installed capacity times the number of hours in a year. And in this graph, we had a deeper look at the capacity factor of thermal power plants, because for wind and solar, it's quite straightforward. You have little margin in how to, basically the capacity factor depends on how much wind there is, how much solar, how much daylight you have and how much clouds you have. So you don't have much control over it. However, when we're talking about thermal power plants, we could say the same with nuclear to a lesser extent, but the capacity factor is linked to a strategy. How much do we want to use this power plant, depending on its marginal cost, depending on the price of CO2 emission, associated CO2 emissions, for instance. And when we look at the evolution of the thermal, the average, so on the left here, on the average thermal capacity factor by region, it's interesting to see that the trend is mostly stable. So there are, of course, some differences. For instance, in Latin America, in 2020, essentially due to COVID, you had a strong decrease of those capacity factors due to a slowdown in demand. You can see the same actually in Europe here. On the other hand, actually, in Asia, you had an increase of the capacity factor of thermal power plants, possibly due to the slowdown of new capacities and a still growing demand. But what's interesting to look at is that the only region in which we have a downward trend is Europe. So the blue line here is the only one that is structurally decreasing over the years. And if we look on the right here at company level, you can see that, so this is the evolution of the capacity factor between 2020 and 2023. We didn't necessarily have the data before 2020. And If it's green, it means that the capacity factor has increased. If it's red, it means that it has decreased. And you can see that only in Europe has the capacity factor decreased almost everywhere. This is due to the fact that a lot of power plants are switching actually their use from baseload utilization to a peak load ones. So they are less and less used, which is a good news for the climate, which is a good news in terms of CO2 emission, but can raise concerns in terms of profitability of those assets, because you have the same power plant that but you produce less electricity over the year, so you need to find a way to finance this power plant. This won't be the topic of this seminar, but it's something that we will rather gladly dive into in a future webinar or publications. Now we are going to look at the evolution of installed capacity per energy source. So how has the electricity park evolved? You see a strong difference between Asian and I could even say between Chinese players versus the rest of the world, in particular North America and Europe. Asian companies tend to be focused on growing because they have to meet with a growing demand for electricity. And so for some of them, the evolution of in terms of CO2 emission is rather focused on increasing more and more renewable assets faster, if possible, than thermal assets. While in Europe and in North America, to a lesser extent, they tend to be a trend to decommission thermal assets. So you can see, for instance, it with Enel, with ENGIE here, with LWE. There can be two reasons for that. There can be even three reasons. The first one is the decommissioning because of the end of life of an asset. It's the case here for the small decommissioning of Type Power, for instance. And the second one is the forced phase out of a power plant that hasn't reached its end of life. That's the case for a large share of coal and gas assets for ENGIE, for instance, for the coal phase out in Germany, or the phase out of the Fessenheim nuclear reactor in France. Just to clarify, one exception here that you can see is Vistra Energy in the US. This strong increase in capacity is not due to the construction of more power plants, it's due to the acquisition of the company DyEnergy in 2018. So it's an external acquisition. And finally, the third way of reducing your park of thermal assets is by selling these power plants. So if we look at ENGIE, for instance, we have a bit around 30 gigawatts of capacity, of lower capacity in terms of coal, gas, a bit of not sure what the rest is, but this includes at least 5 gigawatts of coal that have been closed since 2015, 1.2 gigawatt of gas that has been closed since 2015, but the rest is the selling of assets to other companies. And maybe one last thing interesting with this graph is that if you look at the evolution of solar and wind, without surprise, in Asia, there is a strong increase of solar and wind capacity. We'll come to that later, but it's also present among the largest European utilities, EDF, Enel, ENGIE, Iberdrola, RWE, for instance, EDP in Portugal. But this is way less present in the US, North America in general. A possible explanation for that is that because those capacities have been installed, there has been a strong increase of solar and wind capacities in the US and Canada. But probably more largely due to non-historical GenCos, to specialized companies or newcomers. That plus a large share also of distributed capacity, especially for PV. A brief slide, but to show that this difference in terms of exchange of assets can, of course, it's partially due to the situation of the country. If you're in a country where you need to face with an increasing demand, you need to increase your capacities. But the second factor is also the type of company you're in. A state-owned company tend to be less. They tend to tend to be driven, sorry, by the national policy solely, while companies that have a private majority or for which the government has a majority stake, but for which still part of the shareholding is publicly listed. They tend to be driven also by the market, which encourages them to lower their CO2 emission and thus to force the decommission of thermal assets. If we look at carbon-free generation, so what type of production, what is the ranking of companies in terms of carbon-free power generation? We have a top 10 here that includes the 5 Chinese GenCos that we looked at, 2 European ones, so EDF and Enel, and 3 actually American ones, North and South America included, Constellation Energy, Hydro-Québec, and Electrobras. Among those, 2 are nuclear-focused companies, so Constellation Energy in the US and EDF in France. 3 are hydro-focused companies, so Trigorge in China, Hydro-Québec, and Electrobras. But those companies have an historical portfolio of carbon-free electricity producing assets. However, the 5 remaining ones have a carbon-free power production that's essentially driven by non-hydro renewables, or solar and wind, essentially. And this is new. We did similar webinar 2 years ago. Some of you might have seen it. The ranking was quite different, and especially I think the 5 Chinese companies were already in the ranking, but they've all been gaining places. Enel was not in there at the time, and this is due to a strong increase in solar and wind capacities.
Yeah, that's right, Baptiste. And actually, this analysis was made more like 4 years ago, and there's been a tremendous change since then. In terms of those companies and the solar and wind capacities. Yes, it's noticeable.
Maybe just a few words also to mention that for some companies for this year, it wasn't really able also to gather some information, for example, for Russian companies or Ukrainian companies for which it was, well, data that wasn't published. So that's also a reason why.
Yeah, we could also mention Japanese companies.
Yes.
JERA, KEPCO, that were not included due to a lack of data here. If we focus a bit on China, so we presented 5 GenCos in China, but they are not the only one. We could, if we focus on the 8 largest companies in China, 5 of them here are used to be what was called China State Power Corporation, so a national company, and which was dismantled in 2002. And among the 5 other companies, Only Huadian was not included also here due to a lack of data. But we included the Trigors Dam power generation company. And we did not include, as I said earlier, the nuclear specific CGN and CNNC nuclear specific companies. Those 5 GenCos that covered, they represent 39 to 40%, say, of Chinese electricity production. 2/3 from thermal production, 1/3 from renewables, and 2% from nuclear in between the commas. Over the year, their capacity has kept on increasing for all of them, mostly in par with the evolution of the total installed capacity in China. What's interesting to see in terms of comparison is that just these 5 GenCos since 2000, let's say that for the last 3 years, they pretty much represent the installed capacity of the European Union, which is quite impressive in terms of comparison, and they are quite close to the installed capacity of the United States. These 5 companies are essentially China-driven, meaning that their international scope represent around 2% of the installed capacity. They do have some assets abroad. For instance, CTGPC owns hydropower assets and wind assets in Europe and South America. It's not necessarily new construction. It can be just an investment in an existing power plant, for instance. It's the case in Brazil for CTGPC, for instance. And I present this slide because when here I present a focus on wind, solar will be following. We don't have the exact share of wind in China, so there might be a slight difference because the capacity that we present here is the total wind capacity, international wind capacity of the power plant. But as we saw here, there's less than a 2% difference compared to the Chinese capacity only. So wind. In wind production has been quite unstable over the years. So we reached a peak at 72 gigawatts in 2020. Then came COVID, essentially. And during 2 years, there has been a strong slowdown of the installed capacities. Only 48, if I'm not mistaken, in 2021, only 48, 36, 37 in 2022. But since 2023, we reached an all-time high at 75, 76 gigawatts of newly installed capacity. Is that enough? No. If we looked at our EnerGreen scenario, we expect China to install until 2030 at least 85 gigawatts per year of wind, and even more between 2030 and 2050, and not 2030. We expect China to install over 110 gigawatts per year. So there needs to be an increase in terms of installed capacity, and these trends can be found in other regions as well. We won't detail, but we have the same type of trend for Europe. It's interesting to see also that since 2022, there was the end of feed-in tariffs for wind project in China. If we compare this graph with solar installations are very different. Since 2019, there has been a steady growth of solar installation. with 2023 being an all-time high, and by far with over 200 gigawatts of solar that have been installed in China only. Those 200 gigawatts represent 60% of global capacities. 60%, 2/3 of global capacities are installed in 2023 are in China. And even though since 2021, there are no more subsidies for large PV power plants in China. It's interesting to compare this evolution with the share of distributed PV. So distributed PV represents roughly 45% of the new installation in 2023. When I say distributed PV, I mean rooftop PV, essentially, that is not owned by large companies, but rather by the owner of the roof. And in this case, this is a very large share of national capacities that is not owned by the large state-owned companies. And in between 2020 and 2022, so during the COVID period, GenCos, the new installation by GenCos represented 40% of those solar capacities. In 2023, it's only 28% here. Which means that they have been GenCos have been keeping the growth, have been pushing the growth, especially during COVID in China. But since last year, there is a very strong increase that is not only GenCos dependent. And even among centralized PV installations, the 5 GenCos that we looked at here, they only represent 50% of centralized PV installation. Are we in track with the Paris Agreement? In this case, yes. If I do the same comparison as before, so compared to our EnerGreen scenario, there should be 170 gigawatt per year of solar and 200 gigawatt per year of solar between 2030 and 2050. The question is, will this speed of development continue over the years first? And also, in a scenario where there are more solar than expected and less wind than expected, what impact will this have on especially on the flexibility demand and how to adapt the grid to the daily and seasonal changes in the electricity demand? Now, let's talk a bit about CO2 emissions. And we'll keep some time for Q&A afterwards. But in terms of carbon intensity, so in this graph, we represent the evolution of the carbon intensity of GenCos between 2016 and 2023. So the beginning of the arrow is 2016, the end of the arrow obviously is 2023. And if it's green, it means that the company achieved to lower its carbon intensity over the years. And the two lines that you can see, the orange line is the average carbon intensity of the region for power production in 2022. And the brown one is what it should be in 2030, sorry, according to the EnerGreen scenario. So to summarize, on average, we're here and we should be there in 5 to 6 years now. The good news is that most companies covered here, and I say covered here because some of the Chinese companies didn't provide CO2 emission data. Most companies shown here achieved to reduce their carbon intensity, which is a good news. We have a few exceptions, especially CFE, so the national player in Mexico, for instance, EnBW in Germany, which is mostly due to the phase out of nuclear activities. But most of them have achieved to reduce their CO2 emission. However, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily enough. If we look at a player like Vistra Energy, CMS, RWE, for instance, despite strong efforts, there is still a long path to follow to reach a sufficient path for the 2-degree world, a world with less than 2-degree heating global warming by 2050. And if we look at it in a more dynamic way, so we present here the variation over the years between 2015 and 2023 in terms of carbon intensity on the x-axis here. So basically, if you're here, it means that you have made the largest effort to reduce your carbon intensity. In terms of power generation variation, so if you're here, it means that you're producing way more than you used to produce in 2015. If you here, it means that you produce less than you used to produce in 2015. And we can see some trends. So Ørsted is a bit of an exception here because they produce basically 1.5 times what they used to produce in 2015, but at the same time, due to a lot of external acquisition, they reduce strongly their carbon intensity. But globally, among European companies, so the one in blue here, we can see a trend in both carbon intensity decrease. That's what we saw in the last slide, but also in reduction of power generation, total power generation, mostly due to the slowdown in the demand electrification in Europe. We have a middle here with a lot of companies that have made efforts, but less obvious, sorry, in terms of evolution of carbon intensity, and with less variation in their power mix, rather either quite stable, like Gazprom, Duke Energy, for instance, but also slightly increasing. The size of the dots is the total CO2 emissions in 2023. So it shows the companies for which the most effort is needed. So, and a lot of European companies the dots are so small that you can barely see them. That's why we added the small lines here. When you compare it to Waneng, for instance, in China, to CFE in Mexico, we see sadly that a lot of the effort on CO2 emissions remains to be done by companies that still not on track in terms of evolution of their carbon intensity variation. A few words to wrap up, and then we'll be taking your question. So to summarize what we said on China. China GenCos are by far the largest globally. We said that the big five represent 39% of the world Chinese capacity in 2023. They are state-owned, they are backed by the central government. However, distributed solar is gaining a growing share of the market. This share is not controlled by the historical GenCos. So this could lead to some changes in power generation in China. However, and thanks to this, actually, over the last years, these GenCos reached unexpected and unprecedented level of renewable installations, especially for solar. I think you can see on any kind of scenario prediction on the evolution of solar capacities. It's for the last years has always been more than what was expected. So I said earlier that 2/3 of the solar capacities installed globally were in China, which speaks for itself. But building renewable capacities may not be enough. There also need to be a slowing down of thermal assets, reduction in the long term of their capacity factors. So we only looked here in the slide at the path to increase renewable capacities. There is still a path to decrease thermal assets and their use. In the rest of the world, most of the European, large share also of North American GenCos have deployed low carbon strategies. We have national coal phase-out strategies that can already be seen, especially in Europe. The phase out, the first phase out, so the phase before the end of life of thermal assets, can be seen mostly in Europe and North America. At the same time, we have a lot of, especially European GenCos, EDF, Enel, NG, Iberdrola, that significantly increased their solar and wind capacities over the year. And in some cases, especially for some German companies, the end of the decommissioning of nuclear capacities has hurt the emission factor of those operators. And finally, I said it earlier, there is a decrease in Europe of the capacity factor of thermal assets, which is a good news in terms of CO2 emissions, but raise a lot of questions in terms of how to pay for these assets. A lot of solution exists. We can talk about flexibility market, capacity market, but that will be for another webinar. Thank you.
That's right. Thanks, Baptiste. So I think the timing is pretty good. It leaves a few minutes for Q&As. So do we have any questions at that point?
So
yes, exactly. So I was just about to present the question. So the first one we had was how to manage, how do Enerdata manages to stay up to date with the latest GenCo data? If Baptiste, you want to answer, for example.
Okay, I can answer. You can complete my list.
Yes.
Basically, what we do here is we have two main methodologies. First, we have a yearly overlook of each of every annual report and sustainability report produced by the GenCos that were presented here. So I said it at the beginning. We detail their capacities, their emissions, but also we cross-check this data with the bottom-up data that we have from our power plant tracker. So we are able to compare the total installed capacity with the detailed power plant by power plant, which, for instance, is very useful to get information on whether it's a forced decommission or not, if it's an asset, if the evolution is due to an asset that has been sold or not. So we cross and this and the update of power plant tracker is a continuous process.
And if I may complete just a bit about how to stay up to date, we shall also keep in mind that different regions in the world do not publish their publication at the same time within the year, for example. So some regions publish more at the beginning of the year and some at the end of the year. So that's also the reason why, for example, this presentation is made at the end of the year 2024 for data on 2023. So yes, that is how we stay up to date on the latest GenCos.
All right, thanks. Next question, please.
So how do Enerdata validate the accuracy of the data used?
My list, you want to take this one?
Yes. So you kind of answered this question with your answer before. So we first collect data from the reports, then we cross-check with our internal tools that we have, facilities, well, power plants, by power plants from our power plant tracker tool that we have. And we also do some benchmarking with different reports that are published on the market also.
Thanks. Next.
Why is Enerdata using a scenario under 2 degrees and not 1.5 degrees Celsius?
I may answer this one maybe because
okay.
This is a question that we've had quite frequently. It's just that we are. I mean, it's already quite a stringent scenario, -2 degrees. In it, what corresponds to the Paris Agreement, more or less, in terms of what was pledged at that time. So that's why we want to stick with that. And it's already very, very, very ambitious. And let's say that it's for the sake of, doing projections and benchmarking scenarios, because besides these EnerGreen scenarios, we have the EnerBlue scenario, which corresponds to the NDCs that have been pledged last year. So this is why it's interesting to have this EnerGreen scenario to benchmark it with the latest NDCs, and you can see that it's already quite challenging to probably to achieve those EnerBlue/NDC scenario, showing that EnerGreen is even more challenging. So this is why we don't want to add another scenarios at 1.5 at this point. I don't know, Baptiste, if you have something to add up to that.
No, it's the same answer. Okay. Do Enadata follow up sustainability strategies for GenCo, coal phase-out strategies, areas development strategies? This one will be for Maëlys.
Yes, we do indeed follow up sustainability strategies for GenCos. So that's really in our, well, it was not really it was the subject of this presentation, but we have more in-depth information strategy-wise within our tool product. In the company dashboard, we have really a description of the activities of the company, but also their goals that, yeah, we can see here on the top of the screen exactly.
You cannot read, but basically at the beginning of every dashboard, we present the key elements of the sustainability strategy of the company.
Either sustainability or simply the strategy, because we have to say it's not all the GenCos do present sustainability focused strategies. So, yes.
Yeah, in other words, it's strategy of which sustainability strategy.
Exactly.
What is the difference between thermal assets and coal, gas, and oil assets? Slide on coal phase out. I'm not sure about the last part, but this will be quite quick to answer. Basically, when we don't have the detail between coal, gas, and oil for a given GenCo, we usually have an aggregated category that is thermal assets, which also includes biomass, by the way. And so in the slides where we both present for a company coal, gas, oil, biomass, and for another one thermal, it just means that it's the level of granularity that was given by the companies, and we were not sure enough to, let's say, to present the dispatch of this granularity with enough certitude.
Yes, for example, without giving names, for example, in Asia, some companies do consolidate all their thermal. So for us, it's simply impossible to estimate or make gross estimations about distinguishing coal, gas, and oils.
Yes, and our policy in Power Plant Tracker and the company dashboard is not to rely on not to display guesstimates. We're not providing guesstimates. We prefer to stick with the with the sound and verified data.
It seems that only some specific thermal power plants technologies, OTGT for gas power plant, can provide daily flexibility. Or is it possible that thermal assets switch from base load to peak load purposes? It's not only it's of course gas. We speak a lot about gas peakers. So gas OTGT and CCGT in particular are commonly used to satisfy peak demand. But we can also see this kind of trend to a lesser extent on coal, for instance. If I take the example of France during the winter 2022, if I'm not mistaken, where there were some issues with the nuclear power plants, there had been a small reopening of coal assets to satisfy the demand that did not produce during the rest of the year. So of course, if you just need to produce to satisfy a peak for 1 or 2 hours, it tends to be more relevant to use a gas power plant. However, at a yearly level, if we look at the capacity factor at a yearly level, we have some assets, especially coal ones, that will only be turned on during the coldest winter months, for instance. Question 7, are data in gross or net capacity?
Well, this answer will be quite quick. It's in net capacity that we gather information.
Can you please recap the difference between gross and net?
Baptiste, if you want.
The gross capacity of the power plant, so the net capacity, to make it more clear, is the production, the volume of electricity that is injected into the grid, while the gross capacity is the full production. In the meantime, you need some of this electricity for the self-use of and the losses of the power plant.
That's clear, thanks. So maybe we have
What-
time for a last one, if there is any.
I think this one will be for my list. Why wasn't EnerData able to cover Japanese companies?
Well, that goes with the first explanations that we gave at the beginning, is that we are really dependent on the companies publishing, meaning that, for example, if a company really publishes in a way different from a year to another, or the data are disseminated in a different way, it makes the job more difficult for us. And this year it was more difficult than 2 years ago. It was 4 years ago. So if job is required, for example, to try and uncover these data, it could be done.
If some people from Japanese companies are listening to us, we'll be more than happy to give our feedback on what would be the best way to present the data.
Yeah, and you know, we've made this analysis now, but it's probably something that can be updated you know, on a regular basis once we have more information about those Japanese players, for example. But you know, long story short, I mean, in the power plant tracker platform, we update the data, you know, as soon as the source is available. So it's as it was pointed out, this is an ongoing exercise that's updated on an ongoing basis. So we keep our eyes open, wide open, and looking at Japan, among others. All right. Well, thanks very much, Maëlys, Baptiste. So
Thank you.
that's a wrap. Thanks very much to every one of you, the audience, and thanks for the insightful questions. You will be getting the PowerPoint presentation by email by tomorrow. So just give us a little bit of time to make the slight amendments. But you will be receiving it, that's for sure. And let's keep in touch. I mean, you may ask any question that you have by email, research@enerdata.net. That's research@enerdata.net. And yeah, see you soon for another webinar then. Bye-bye, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.